When it comes to Ukraine, the war is continuing with repeated successes for Russia on the ground. Outside of the battlefield, however, major developments continue to take place. For example, British military intel has said that Russia is moving reserve forces from across the country and assembling them near Ukraine for future offensive operations. This is while the UK itself has become more involved in the war by supplying Kiev with weapons, just like the US. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the deliberate moves by the US, NATO, and its allies to continue the war and its consequences. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Senior Research Fellow at Global Policy Institute from London Metropolitan University, George Samioli, joins us from Budapest. We also have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich, who joins us from Belgrade. Okay, welcome to you both. Let me start with you, George Samioli, first. We're looking at successive Russian successes on the ground in terms of the developments there. That is pretty significant. Can you please tell us what direction this means this whole conflict is heading to when you have these successes? Because according to Britain, it has concluded that Russia is unlikely to withdraw from large parts of the land in the southern part of Ukraine's coast, and at the same time says that this is not a sign that Russia actually wants the war to end, because along with U.S. officials, Putin, according to them, wants to seize more of Ukraine and maybe most of Ukraine. Do you see it that way?
Well, I think it's clear that Russia's military objectives have altered as this campaign has continued. I think that on February the 24th, when they launched their special military operations, I think they probably envisaged at that time the liberation of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and then some kind of a peace settlement with the government in Kiev. As the Kiev government has refused to negotiate seriously any kind of an agreement with Russia, and as it's continued the fight and continued to receive more and more sophisticated armaments from the West, and has shown itself to be absolutely determined to continue fighting, then I think Russia's objectives are now much more extensive. I think that they cannot settle for just the liberation of Donetsk and Lugansk. They're going to keep going until either they remove the Zelensky government, in other words, they'll just have to leave, or Zelensky will sign an unconditional surrender. But what Russia will not accept is an arrangement whereby they stop fighting while Kiev continues to lob missiles and fire its very sophisticated rockets into the Donbass, into Crimea, into the territory of Russia, because then Russia will feel, well, this is exactly where we were before February the 24th, so what have we achieved? So I think Russia's ambitions have extended as this fight has continued, because at the moment there's really, there's nothing that Russia can settle for, which they could regard as a reasonable settlement.
So, John Bosnich, do you agree with that? I mean, we're looking at the fact that Russia has even said, the Russian-UK ambassadors said, we're not going to give up where we're at in southern Ukraine. Anytime there was a withdrawal, according to the way he sees it, he said that there have been provocations and people start getting shot at, and the war will continue. So at a minimum, they're going to stay there, and according to our guest, perhaps Russia has aspirations to move deeper into Ukraine. Do you see it that way?
Well, I think this has to be seen from three main aspects. Militarily, Russia needs to secure, if it intends to hold on to this territory, and they've indicated that they're planning to hold on to at least Crimea forever by having annexed it to Russia proper. They need to retain a defensible position around Crimea, which means access to Crimea by a land bridge and access to Crimea by a physical constructed bridge. That requires the coastline of the Black Sea to be held at least to the land bridge to Crimea, and it requires the entire continuous seacoast on either side of that land bridge. So we can expect Russia to hold this simply from a tactical perspective. Next, on the political angle, if there is an opportunity for Russia to reach a negotiated settlement with the regime in Kiev, and the chances of that are diminishing, apparently, if we listen to what Zelensky says and we take it at face value. But if there is still a potential for a negotiated settlement that would allow Russia to secure the human rights and safety of the ethnic Russian citizens of what was once a unified single Ukraine, then there is a possibility for negotiations. So long as NATO is backing up the Kiev regime, those talks are high because pushing Zelensky to resist. That's the political angle. And finally, the long economic angle would suggest that Russia would attempt to hold the entire Black Sea coastline all the way across to Romania, which would include Ostapol, where the marking incident of this conflict of the trade unionists action of Russian forces with the restricted zone in, and that is political and aspect which would turn the
Okay.
coastline of the Black Sea.
All right. Unfortunately, some of your words we did not decipher because you were getting cut off. But I think we understood what you were relaying there on your third point. George Samiele, I guess there are talks about the political front of things in terms of any type of talks to end this, but it certainly doesn't look that way coming from the U.S.-led NATO, including the U.S. and of course the European countries involved in this. For example, one of the latest developments coming is that British forces are beginning to be trained. British forces are training Ukrainian soldiers, and we heard there are up to 10,000 of them, and they have little to no military experience or any skills to be effective on the frontline combat. That in itself really puts things into perspective and questionable as to how they're going to go into this war. First of all, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, why embark on this, which sounds like it, according to the report I'm looking at, that's going to take months for them to get trained in order to get ready from zero skills to something basic to go and deal with Russia?
Well, you're absolutely right, and that goes incidentally for all of the vast, sophisticated military hardware that the Western powers have been pouring into Ukraine. Because even if they're able to get them to the front, which is itself very questionable, because the front is in the southeast of the country, so it's very hard to get it there without it being destroyed by Russian forces. But even if they were able to, the Ukrainians will not be able to know how to work these systems. I mean, they are very sophisticated. They require a great deal of training before they can be used effectively. And they can't be integrated into the kind of weapons tactical combat scheme just like that, because the Ukrainians are used to fighting with different weapons, with a different tactical formation. So it's great. Oh, we'll send in these multiple launch rocket systems, but I mean, are they going to be able to use it? And of course, they haven't been able to use it. So the military outcome of this war is not in doubt. I mean, it can be delayed, and that just seems to be the goal of Zelensky and his patrons, particularly in London and in Washington, just simply delaying the inevitable and doing as much killing and destruction along the way as possible. But the longer it goes, less and less there'll be of rump Ukraine, because we're now only talking about a rump Ukraine that will remain. There's no question Russia is going to take the Donetsk and Lugansk. I mean, there's not going to be a Minsk-free any sort of negotiation that we'll trust Kiev to look after the human rights of the Russian speakers. I mean, they did that. They tried that in 2014. The Russians burnt their hands on that. They're not going to try it again. So the only alternatives there is either they'll be independent republics or they'll simply be absorbed within the Russian Federation. There's only those two alternatives. But then the question is, of this rump Ukrainian state, how much of it will there be? Because the longer it goes on, the less and less of it there will be. The Russians will just keep moving forward and saying, well, we can't stop, because at the moment we stop, these people are just going to want to seek revenge. They're going to, they're going to keep importing more and more weapon systems, and they're going to keep using these weapon systems against us. So we have to just keep moving. So again, the Western policy is absolutely destructive of Ukraine.
Sure. Well, the Russian president has said, John Busnich, about the fact that basically we're just starting. That's what he said. You got Dmitry Peskov that's doubled down on the threats against Russia, saying that only a small part of Russia's what he calls great military potential was being used. And Putin saying everyone should know that by and large we have not started anything yet in earnest, at the same time saying that he doesn't reject peace talks. Of course, the narrative coming out from the U.S. and some Western media outlets in general is that Russia has suffered a great deal. Lots of military personnel have been killed along with equipment, so it is suffering. What version do you agree with?
Well, obviously, I agree with the Russian version of events. I have 4 of my own reporters reporting to me from the conflict zone, and they are repeating the information that the Russian side is presenting, and they're repeating it from independent sources. So what we have here is a complete military mismatch. I fully agree with my fellow commentator today, George. He's put things forward very clearly. The weapon systems that the West is offering to the Ukrainian forces are weapon systems that the Ukrainians are not trained in, nor are they superior users of those systems. The Russian forces are prepared to fight those systems already and have countermeasures, which means that, in effect, the only way that NATO can effectively use those weapons inside Ukraine is to use so-called dual citizens, people who hold dual American and Ukrainian passports, which means effectively putting American troops into the battle zone. We've already heard that American troops are there dressed in Ukrainian uniforms, giving officer support to the Ukrainian forces, which simply don't have the capacity to respond to the Russian officer corps. So, if things do develop to the point that we see more Western weapons actually deployed and being used in the region, what we have is a case of U.S. boots on the ground and English boots on the ground in the battle zone. And that is a potential complication which would have severe political consequences in the West.
Well, I didn't want to dedicate so much time of our program to this, but George Samueli, I can't help but to ask another question, military in nature, and that is the fact that what makes the U.S. think that it's going to be able to assist Ukrainian soldiers or even novices in winning when it itself has not won a war? I mean, how did it do in Syria? How did it do in Afghanistan? I think they had 100,000 troops there at the height of it, right? How did they do? They couldn't defeat 10,000 Taliban soldiers at that point. Or we call them terrorists or extremists, but now things have changed, obviously. So, it doesn't match logic here, does it?
Not in the slightest, and that's why the Western media coverage has been so bizarre, because they settled on a narrative which they've been going with for several months, that Russia's doing very badly, Russia's losing, Russia's failing, because they haven't been able to defeat Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is a formidable country. I mean, it's a country, population 45 million, but the 7th largest in Europe. By territory, it's the 2nd largest in Europe. It's been trained for 8 years by NATO, and NATO has been pouring in lots of arms for 8 years. This wasn't a bunch of goat herders that took on the Russians, and you say, "Whoa, boy, the Russians haven't been able to defeat them." But in fact, Russia has been making steady progress, and it's only been essentially just over 4 months the United States was engaged in Afghanistan for 20 years and then got walloped by the Taliban. It was engaged in Iraq and failed to achieve any real objectives in Iraq. I mean, and then we're going back in time into Southeast Asia. So, these, again, the United States took on powers that were by no means formidable military powers and weren't able to defeat them. So it's bizarre that there was this expectation that, well, if Russia can't win this war in 3 days, that means it's failed and it's lost the war.
Yeah, and John Buster, it's very scary when you have what Putin has said, that the U.S. Wants this to go on until the last Ukrainian is standing. But let's get a little bit of a idea from you about the economics of this whole war, of which it is obviously affecting different parts of the world, if not most of it. President Vladimir Putin has issued another warning that it's going to be catastrophic energy prices for European consumers. We're looking at the winter. I'm sorry, we're looking at the summer right now, but come winter, that is said to be maybe a turning point where there might be a wake-up call from Europeans, if it's not already, that maybe we should stop this. Do you think that we're looking at this war in terms of the temperature?
Absolutely, absolutely. There was the Western media sort of false prediction that Russia was going to try and make some kind of a blitzkrieg in Ukraine, and that they were not achieving that. It's obvious from the field, from all of the independent reporters in the field, and there are many of them from the West and from the East, that Russia is not attempting a blitzkrieg. Russia is attempting to secure territory and to secure people, to try to minimize the losses from their own forces and to minimize the losses on the Ukrainian side. Russia has not been attempting to massively kill Ukrainian soldiers. They have been hoping that Ukrainian soldiers would surrender en masse, and that's what's been happening. So it's not the war that the West expected. It's not the war that the Western media told us was taking place. It is the war that Russia decided it would pursue, and is actually a denazification operation designed to neutralize Ukraine as a threat to Russia. Very straightforward.
Of course, the energy factor here remains one of the most important issues, George Samiali.
Yes.
And if you take a look at the top 5 oil-producing countries, for example, this is just an example. What do you have? You have Saudi Arabia, you have Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran, who are the top 4. And then you have Venezuela and Iran, and of course Russia, we have to mention, who have, we can call it an alliance of some sort, especially since Iran has signed 20-year agreements with both, which control 40% of the market. So you can see where I'm going with this question. I mean, isn't the U.S. and the Europeans jeopardizing energy and oil flows if they continue with this war, because they don't have the upper hand if you look at it through that lens?
Yes, it's without question, and it's particularly hard on Europe because, of course, the United States is itself a major oil producer, and so historians will come to reflect in later years why it was that the Europeans allowed themselves to be browbeaten into going along with an American plan from which only the Europeans would suffer, and the Americans really wouldn't suffer very much. So the Europeans at the moment are committed, essentially, to cutting themselves off from all Russian oil imports by the end of the year. There'll be a little bit of give and take. Hungary will be allowed to go on for a bit. Slovakia will be allowed to go on for a bit. But the problem is they haven't figured out, well, where are they going to get their oil from? It's not like you can just simply turn on the spigot and somebody else is going to make up for the shortfall, because that's not how the oil industry works. I mean, the oil industry, in fact, the energy industry in general, works on the basis of long-term contracts. It's in terms of the expectations of long-term consumers, and that's not what's happening. You can't just ask Saudi Arabia and say, well, can you increase your oil production by 30 or 40%? Well, I mean, they can't do that. I mean, because everything is already catered for. And in any case, one country's oil may not be suitable for another country's refineries. So they haven't really thought this through, and essentially they are indeed heading towards a winter, which is going to be quite nasty, because apart from they don't have any replacement for the Russian oil, there's also the issue of the gas from Russia, because it's quite likely the Russians are going to slowly but steadily start cutting off their gas flow to Europe, and that's going to affect profoundly Germany, which is the economic powerhouse of Europe, and a major economic superpower in its own right. And the Germans are already panicking that this is the end of their economic miracle.
Then we want to take a look at a bigger picture here, if that's even possible, with you, John Busnich, and that is how there has been what's called a shift, and now the world order is really different since the Ukraine conflict broke out, or a special military operation, or a war. Take your pick. So are we looking at that where you see countries to have shifted towards the east, because we're looking at Russia, Latin America, for example, with the snub that many of these countries gave the U.S. in that conference that many boycotted, and also, of course, looking at West Asian countries or Middle East, like Iran shifting towards the east. Are we looking at this shift being a permanent one?
Absolutely. This is a tectonic shift in the world geopolitical situation. The center is moving to the east. Russia is replacing the consumers that it is giving up in Europe with greater sales to China in particular, and to other countries that are dependent on its oil. And the Russian orientation is a double one. Provide economic support to the main challenger to the Western economies, which is providing economic oil and gas support to China, and restrict oil and gas supplies to Germany, and thereby shut down the economic motor of the European economy, thus bringing a recession. And if there's a recession in Europe, it's impossible to budget the money necessary to maintain a long-term war. And then we see a situation where America has to strong-arm Europe to do what Europe does not have the resources to do, which could push Russia and Germany closer together if a peace agreement is reached. And that could take Germany out of the American order. And that it would be a tectonic change of such magnitude that it hasn't been paralleled since the end of World War II.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. John Busnich, journalist, activist, and political analyst. And thank you, George Samieli. It's good to see you again, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute at London Metropolitan University from Budapest. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kaveh Tahwe and the team. It's goodbye.